Oh, hello there. I'm sitting in front of my fireplace here, and it's funny, there's something very primal about fire. I feel, strangely, I almost feel kind of the presence of the ancestors, as it were, when I sit in front of a fire. The atmosphere gets a little bit thicker. And it always makes me think about the alchemists. See, the truth is, I don't really identify as a Jungian. I can't really identify as a Jungian because of the Jungians. But I do identify as an alchemist. That's really the closest job description for what I'm trying to do with my project. Of course, alchemy within the Jungian interpretation of alchemy as a kind of psychological discipline. So you might say, well, doesn't that make you really more of a Jungian if you're nesting alchemy and Jung? And yeah, I guess so, kind of. But anyway, the point of this recording is that the stuff that I'm doing on the channel is really tightly controlled in a way. It's like there's an agenda, right? There's like content that I'm trying to move through, and so I get into this kind of professorial mode with it, and that's all. And then I aestheticize the crap out of it and all that sort of thing. And so it's all of that's good, but I also want to preserve room to just be a little more natural and a little more direct in what it is I'm sort of trying to do here. And so I thought, why not get in the habit of recording some just totally unproduced, essentially video logs like this, and kind of interleave them with the bigger, sort of extremely worked over sync century videos. So the liability there is that I'm just going to kind of be doing stream of consciousness type of stuff, so here's something to say just right off the bat. The things I'm talking about in the main Sync Century videos are reflective of where my thinking was at about a year and a half ago. So, and I'm sort of trying to work my way through a bunch of material so that I can get up to the place where I can talk about the things that are sort of actively on my mind now. And so some of the stuff I'm going to be rambling about here might not make total perfect sense yet, but it will for some of you, because I know that some of the people watching this have gone through their own initiations into, let's just use the Jungian terminology and say have had their own confrontations with the unconscious, and so kind of know what this is all about. But perhaps for some other people this will all seem a little bit cryptic. But anyway, so that's all the kind of the intros and apologies out of the way. Now it's just time for a good ramble around the fire. This will probably be old hat for really probably most of you who are watching this channel, but Jung's insight into the alchemists, you see, is that the alchemists thought they were explaining natural process, but that in fact they were kind of naively projecting a map of the unconscious. You might say unconsciously projecting a map of the unconscious. when thinking about this stuff, it's it's not clear exactly what's going on at the technical level. We just don't know. We don't know what psyche is or how it's actually operating. It seems clear that we can describe it in a very high-level way as a system of some sort, but that doesn't tell us much. The language of systems is the most general abstract language that we have for speaking about phenomena of any sort. If you can't capture it in the language of systems, it's almost as if you can't. I don't know if this is quite true, but it's such a general metaphor, the metaphor of system, that if you can't capture it in that metaphor, I think it's pretty unlikely that you can think about it coherently at all, right? So, good thing that we can seem to capture at least some of what psyche is in the language of systems. But of course, that doesn't really, if you give a systems account of it, it's not. You're leaving out so much. For instance, the entire affective experiential domain, which, in my view, is actually primary. Systems is a powerful metaphor, but it's still a linguistic construction. And experience precedes the linguistic construction. So anyway, the alchemists, what was the experience of the alchemists, right? Well, the alchemists were working with elemental processes. They were essentially proto-chemists in terms of the kind of laboratory work that they were doing. But in attempting to answer the mysteries of nature, you see, it's sort of like this. So I'm going to use another metaphor here, and this is really just a metaphor. Well, I guess I don't know that it isn't deeper than a. It could be more than a mere analogy. Let's say that, or it could just be an analogy. I don't know, but it seems to me that it has something to do with. Or if you think of it in terms of resonance, you're kind of on the right track. So it's like. What is it like? It's like certain images, ideas, phenomena. Let's just say objects of perception and keep it as general as possible. Certain objects of perception contain homomorphisms with unconscious structures. Okay, so they're somehow at some level of analysis similar to underlying unconscious systems and structures. And so when you perceive those objects, or meditate on them, it's like they're vibrating at, again, analogy, but it's like they're vibrating at a certain frequency. And then you have to think of the unconscious kind of as a terrain with certain cavities, and those different cavities sort of resonate at different frequencies. And so when you encounter one of these objects of perceptions, it's as if it's resonating different cavities of the unconscious. You could think of it more in the language of systems. You could say that certain systems or subsystems of the psyche, unconscious subsystems, are activated by the perception of objects that symbolize or in some way structurally synchronize, latch onto properties of the underlying systems. So you see, then when you're trying to say what is the meaning of fire, what is the meaning of water, what is the meaning of change or transformation, what is the meaning of this particular chemical reaction where it moves from something subtle into something gross, or or the inverse. Say we go from a gas to from a solid to a gas or something. What is the meaning of that? Well, there's like an unconscious meaning to it, or it's correspondent with an unconscious process or structure. So then the alchemists are trying to kind of answer this question, and essentially what they're doing is they're following two things, presumably. They're following their intuition, which has to do with unconscious associations and the unconscious direction of unconscious attention. So what you notice and what you're looking at is determined by, at least once you start entering into the projective zone, is determined by unconscious processes. But then they're also following numinosity, which is a very particular affective experience. It's the feeling of the divine somehow puncturing into the experiential field. And I think we have to be pretty sensitive to the fact that different people experience reality in different ways. I think that we're kind of there in the intellectual world a little bit, in that we admit that people have different worldviews, but that's still something linguistic. You know, our experience is deeper than the linguistic metaphors we bring to bear on it. So it's not just a matter of paradigm. There's something deeper than paradigm, which is closer to the raw experience. And numinosity is down there. Numinosity is a deeper affective state in response to some very much lower level sorts of pattern detection than anything we can grok onto with language. It's deeper. It's more fundamental than that. And I think to a certain extent you're either receptive to numinosity or you aren't, right? Some people really aren't. I happen to be extremely receptive to it. And you might say perhaps receptive to the point of imagining it where it isn't there. But therein sort of lies the rub. See, that's really the central conundrum of this whole alchemical thing. It's like, well, okay, let's say I am just sort of seeing it where it isn't there. But but I'm still seeing something. And see, what I'm seeing is something unconscious, projected outwards as if it were there in the material. Is it really there in the material? Well, does it matter? You know? It doesn't really matter if it's directing me back towards an objective psychical phenomena of some sort, right? Or at least that was Jung's view. That's my view as well. So anyway, that's the alchemists. Essentially what I'm doing, and I think what many people in the sync community are doing, is an alchemical procedure, except instead of looking at elemental natural processes, we're looking at like media, right? So we're looking at film, maybe in particular, or at least I concentrate on film. And you can think of film as we can sort of think of it like this, right? You have chemical process, on top of which is built biological processes. So you've kind of ascended a integrative level in the system sense. And then on top of biology, maybe you have intelligent systems, sentient systems, brains happen, right? And then brains, psyches, and I don't mean to equate psyche with brain, because I believe that psyche is a kind of field phenomena of some sort. I think that I don't think that it's localized in the brain. I think it's rather more like the brain tunes into it. That's a conjecture, but a conjecture based on some pretty solid empirical data, I would say. Unfortunately, it's the kind of empirical data that you can only really get yourself. You have to introspect to experience some of the non-local aspects of mind. But so anyway, then you have psyches, which are interacting at least in some way with this. See, I think that it's kind of like psyche is also present. This is now, I hate to kind of go down a stupid technical, taxonomical tangent here, but my view currently is, and this is subject to change, of course, but it seems to me that psyche is present at all the integrative levels. See, I think there's a sort of psyche is already operating at the chemical level and at the atomic level and the quantum level and so on. I think it simply becomes more manifest and more articulated as you ascend the integrative levels. So anyway, psyches, in the state that they exist in human beings, then produce films, which are just cultural artifacts, right? And so part of this is that you've got to dispense a little bit of what you think a film is, right? See, to me, what's axiomatic is the transcendental complexity of reality. I just take that as my sort of starting point. Things are transcendentally complex. And my evidence for that is just ubiquitous. It's just the fact that we're wrong all the time about things. we're constantly incorrect. And generally when we're incorrect, it's because we've missed some kind of, either we've missed a nuance, we've missed a detail, or there's some kind of big picture thing. But both of those are operating at sort of complexity scales that are beyond what we were able to capture. So that's just like saying that an object, the object to which the object of perception refers, right? So not the thing that you perceive, but the actual thing out there, whatever that is. And that's a Kantian distinction, right? We're talking about now the thing in and of itself. That thing is deeper than you can ever access with language, and that you can ever actually perceive. For those of you who don't know object-oriented ontology, it's essentially a philosophy that's sort of making that idea clear. I was about to say rigorous, but object-oriented ontology isn't exactly. Heck, he keeps falling off my shoulder here. It's not exactly a. It's not an analytic philosophy. It comes out of the continental tradition. It comes out of Graham Harman's strange reading of Heidegger, brilliant reading of Heidegger, I think. Anyway, that's all a huge digression. So the point is that you don't know what a film is. Okay, think about how complex your psychology is. We don't understand consciousness. We don't understand the unconscious. And then films are like produced by those complex systems, so that it's going to mirror that complexity. We don't know what's in it. So what you think a film is, it's a very shallow analysis, really. And so generally, when I'm encountering things that are transcendentally complex, which is everything, by the way, but when I'm making the complexity the issue, right, and saying, how can I access more of the, or how can, really, technically I should say, how can I improve my model of the thing to account for more of the complexity, or if I can't get more complexity in my model, how can I make my model more functional, so that the mapping is more homomorphic with the thing I'm trying to understand. Generally, the first thing I try to do is kind of blur the whole thing out, to look at it in a gestalty sort of way, to just try to get some basic structure down. And so if you think about what a film is, one of the most basic things we can say about it is that it's an information object that encodes patterns, right? That's pretty simple. It's a material object, sort of. I mean, for a long time it was, right? It's videotape or film. Now we have it kind of a digital object, but it's the same thing. That digital object, it's still represented in some physical substrate at the end of the day. Even if it's being copied and pushed around the cloud and all that stuff, it's still, by the time you watch it, it's, your screen is a physical thing and it's displaying patterns to you. And so really the way into this is to think of film more as a record or an archive. Or I actually prefer here a kind of archaeological metaphor. I think of film as a kind of a deposit of psychical activity. And so getting a little more concrete in how we think about film, we can now say that it also, it's not just a big mess of patterns, but that there's a certain kind of high-level structure in it. And one of the most basic aspects of that structure is the distinction between figure and ground. Figure is like the big stuff moving around, people, important objects, vehicles, things like that, buildings maybe. Buildings being blown up increasingly. That's seems to be a lot of what we like to watch in movies. And the ground is basically, it's scenery, right? It's background. And so basically you can think of that as sort of large patterns and small patterns, and I mean that quite literally. Like if you were to look at a film strip, you would have like certain areas that are kind of like large patterns, and then the background is like a tiny little detail interwoven in there. And by the way, here's the first sort of interesting insight, is that relationship of figure-ground exists in cinematic artifacts because that's how our psychology is organized, right? We perceive the world in terms of figure and ground. Therefore, we make films that are composed in that way. And, it's like... Typically, we don't pay very much attention to the ground. But you see, that means that the ground, to the extent that it is organized, usually is organized unconsciously, or better yet, organized in a way that's somehow kind of smeared or distributed across a number of people, right? If you think about the way a film is made, it's like, who's responsible for what's in the background? Well, the director, sort of, but a lot of that stuff is made by art departments, set designers. Some of it's like accidental, right? It's like films are shot on location. Who knows what's going to end up in the deep background of a shot? And there's maybe some kind of selection process, like things happen randomly or accidentally, but then the director or the editors are still selecting particular shots where particular things happen and so on. So it's a mixture, in fact, of conscious and unconscious and either coincidental, accidental, or perhaps synchronic procedures that are all feeding into the ground. I don't want to get ahead of myself here and talk too much about the other direction. But I am developing this sort of theory of film analysis called Tri-Planar analysis. And, well, it's right there in the title. I have not only figure and ground, but also firmament. So there's like a third layer. And that third layer is basically, it's not that complicated. It's basically the level of like theme or motif, which are kind of immanent patterns, right? They don't map onto a physical region of the cinematic frame in the way that figure and ground do. It's more about how details or how patterns in figure and ground are organized and how they relate internally and how they're repeated across time, sort of smeared out across time especially. So that's firmament. Or I also have sort of technical designations for these things. It's the microsymbolic plane, the mesosymbolic plane, and the macrosymbolic plane. But the reason why it's alchemical is that it is a projective sort of process, you see, because it's as if it's kind of like this. It's as if the unconscious is generating signal both below and above the standard threshold of... Threshold's not quite the right metaphor, is it? But it's like the region of conscious attention. I think you can even start to imagine a kind of evolutionary story for why that would be the case, like why there's an association. It actually has to do with speed somehow. It's like certain patterns take a long time to notice, right? You have to witness many scenarios to then extract higher level patterns or information that are common to all those scenarios. Those are very slow to perceive, slow to form. Hecky, she's really starting to kind of bug me falling. I'm just going to put her here in front of the fireplace. She can watch the fire while we talk about alchemy and triplanar analysis. What was I talking about? Right, slower to form. And then you have patterns that are like really fast, like things happen before you can even register them consciously, maybe. Some little detail that's there and then it's gone. And so consciousness is kind of, ego consciousness, like the conscious mind, is is kind of extremely, it's specialized in a certain range of patterns. And then the stuff that's happening really slow and the stuff that's happening really fast, those are handled more unconsciously, right? They have to be, because consciousness can only kind of focus on one scale. So anything above or below that scale, the unconscious is sort of tied up in. And so, well, then here's the thing. That's all so far sort of seems like it's oriented outwards. It's like patterns in the environment. But then it's also the case that the unconscious itself seems to be broadcasting pattern at those scales. So if you start to pay attention, say, to the details in your environment, it becomes and the more kind of zeroed in on it you get, it becomes increasingly difficult to differentiate between, because it's like a noise problem. So it's like it gets harder and harder to differentiate between patterns that are objectively there in the environment and projection, right? Patterns inserted into the experiential field by the unconscious. And generally our bias is to say, well, if it's a projection, then you throw it out. Wrong. Wrong. Because if it's a projection, the assumption is that the projection has no semiotic value. It's not organized. It's just going to be random imaginings. Not the case. The unconscious is extremely one note in a certain respect. It's constantly trying to tell you about itself. And so by zeroing in on these subtle domain of pattern recognition, it's like that's where you start to perceive information that's being kind of interleaved into your experiential field by the unconscious, telling you about the unconscious. And it's like if you follow that deeply enough, then it activates the transcendent function, which, once the transcendent function is activated, you're on like a path to massive, well, let's not beat around the bush, spiritual awakening of kind of the first order. And so you can do that. That's how it works with synchronicity, right? Synchronicity it's often very quiet. It doesn't necessarily stay that way. Once the transcendent function is activated, you can get storms of synchronicity that are profound. And eventually you start to see that these small details that the unconscious is directing your attention towards are actually sequenced and structured into like sentences and like larger communications. It's actually telling you things in a very sophisticated, high-level way that it's a symbolic language that's being utilized. But when it starts, it's often very quiet, right? It's just a number on a clock, or a strange recurrent symbol or glyph or something in your environment. So anyway, it's the same thing with this film stuff. It's like if you look at the details, but see, there's a subtle distinction here, and this is how it's both similar to and different from what the old school alchemists were doing. Because a film is not just a natural phenomenon. In a sense, it is a natural phenomenon. Psyche is a natural phenomena. Everything's a natural phenomenon. Film is also, therefore, natural. But it is the product of intelligence. And so, see, it's like a state capture that includes both conscious intention as well as unconscious content, unconscious material. And so, certain artists approach their work less from the ego and more from the standpoint of kind of unconscious flow. And so a lot of unconscious structures can be objectively present in a film, and you can isolate those, amplify them, recover them, and interpret them. But it's also possible to actually project live, right, your own unconscious structures into the film. And see, that's why tri-planar analysis is not just a theory of analysis, but also it's a method, right? It's a method. And the method part of it has more to do with establishing that dynamic live interaction with your own unconscious. So in a sense, you want to go deeper than you should. You want to go down to the level of the noise where you really can't tell if you're just kind of, if it's subjective or objective. The more that boundary blurs, the closer you are to having a conversation with the unconscious directly. which is then what starts to happen. And it's also what happened to the alchemists, right? These like mystical experiences. You can sort of excite those unconscious cavities to such an extent that then they really become, well, they really start talking to you, right? Anyway, see, that's the danger with these sort of off the cuff things, is they just kind of go all over the place, and I don't know if any of that even made any sense, but anyway, I'm just in the point now where I'm trying to kind of work out the finer points of my system, and it's I'm always trying to bring it back down to this level of like signal synchronization, systems interactions, like how is that working? Like what's going on? Like it's a way of perceiving film, like it's perceiving film in a new way, a way that actually turns it into a mirror, a kind of magic mirror that reflects your own unconscious back at you. And if you've never done that, right? If you've never used a projective scrim like that to encounter the unconscious, then you might think, well, why would anybody want to do that? Well, that's the basic mystical problem, isn't it? There is no way to explain this stuff. I mean, there sort of is, but you really just got to do it. You've got to do it. It's empirical. The language, the metaphors that we bring to bear on the experience are infinitely inadequate. All I know for sure is that something happened, right? I started to relate to film in a different way, and in a way that is not just my own. Like, other people are relating to film in this way now too, and it's not just structurally similar. Like, the content is similar. Well, that starts to point you in the direction of archetypal organizing principles, right? I'm excited to finally kind of, that's sort of where I'm going. Like I'm trying to build up to the point where I can make videos about triplanar analysis. Part of that is I have to finalize the system. But so then once triplanar analysis is introduced, then I can introduce the Red Twins constellation. And that ties in with all this 9/11 precognition stuff, which I know is very old news in the sync community. But I think I've got a little more. I've got some new info about it. I've been tracking this particular symbolic structure that I haven't seen anyone mention, that occurs like interfilmically. Like you see it pop up in like a number of different films, and it's extremely what would you say, 9/11 resonant? Let's put it that way. So anyway, I guess maybe that's probably it for now. I'm starting to feel a little fatigued. I think I'll just kind of gaze into the fire for a little bit and see what I might image in there. But, yeah. Till next time.